What does stillness mean to me this time of year? I'd say reflection.
Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
So, what you just heard was our friend Andrew offering a moment at the bonfire we experienced at Simplicity Farm over the winter solstice. As we gathered at Simplicity for a potluck and a bonfire, I had the idea to go around and ask friends and family members what stillness meant to them this time of year. Now, before I did that, there was an incredible moment of shared stillness that we all experienced in lighting that bonfire.
It was a very different kind of lighting of the fire this year. My sense is that it had something very real to do with the moisture within the wood. It also had something very significant to do with the energetic of the winter we're in the midst of. And as we've moved into it, with all of the disharmony that exists out in the world, it's tough for people to access stillness, to find a sense of ease, to find a sense of peace. And I think that it's often that our experiences, our interactions in the world with the natural world often reflect where humanity is within itself. And the fire itself, it began very slowly, like a human awakening. It's arising from slumber. It was stretching itself out until it was able to actually dance more fully and freely. And as the flame grew and the smoke danced with the flame, there was this interplay that was mesmerizing. And, I had asked the group to step into silence as we lit the fire. And it's an interesting request in the sense that I don't give it a beginning or an end. Folks settle, and then people move out of the silence kind of collectively, right? And it was interesting to watch as the flame grew. There was a certain point where you could really see the fire just really rise up and take over. And there was a kind of ooh and ah kind of response from the group. And then the conversation began and folks began to connect with each other. And it was really very emblematic of what was happening within the fire itself. It felt so aligned with, the struggle or the human dance that we're in the midst of, right? I'd like to share a quote that I wrote many years ago and I've rewritten again. It goes like this. We connect to the resolution of our divided world when we are willing to stand on the shore of a river and see with soft eyes what rests on the other side. In making this choice, we no longer see two opposing shores and instead see one river. The quote for me, first and foremost, is about finding within ourselves that place where we can see multiple perspectives. And even if we can't find any truth in the perspective of the other, we can see possibly their pain. We can see their own internal disharmony. We can find empathy, even for those who are advocating in some of the most toxic of ways. And in doing so, we don't become an advocate for their position, but we become an advocate for their humanity, that we all carry value, worth, a right to our own perspective, even if it doesn't mean that we have the right to override that of others, which has often been the case that we're seeing over the last year. Well, not really the last year, for the last, as long as there's been American government, there's been men like we're seeing now acting in the ways that they act. It's just that they've centralized power, right? And if we're going to stand firm in ourselves and find truth and freedom in the midst of it, it means seeing the situation with soft eyes, finding that river and inviting the world to join us there.
To see with those soft eyes, I think, is such a foundational place to be in. And considering our moment in this winter, I'd like to offer our listeners now some of our friends and family once again sharing what stillness means to them this time of year.
After the long days of summer, always resenting being in the house when it's nice outside. It gets cold, it gets dark early, and it's a wonderful time to slow down, to enjoy the wood stove, to be warm, and tackle those things in the house. Being able to stop and just enjoy that I don't need to run outside. And again, just be still.
What does stillness mean to me at this time of year? Hibernating under blankets, sleeping in, sitting in meditation.
What does stillness mean to me this time of year? It's really important this time of year because it means every day it means coming back to myself. And it's easy to get lost this time of year in all the busyness, all the hurry and scurry, and in the darkness too. So it means coming back to myself, coming back to the light inside of myself.
So, in keeping with that lens of stillness, Martin, you and I wanted to reflect and riff a bit off of some topics we had written down that we didn't give a full podcast to. As we explore each of these ideas, how does it relate to stillness? So that's our grounding core idea here.
Right, right. We had at one point explored the nature of mystery and the cultural obsession with mystery novels, shows, movies. And what's interesting is if we go way back in time, right, to our indigenous roots, to way back in history, to our forebears, there was, number one, the great mystery that existed in that world existed with the veil, right? So there was the shaman. He or she was the doorkeeper for the veil, helping people access that in all the ways that are, a part of what it means to be a human, and in that era, deeply connected with nature. When we look at nature now, nature is seen as mysterious, right? The dark woods, all these things. Well, deep in our history, they were a part of that. So the natural world, yes, it held mystery, but they were a part of that mystery. They weren't separate from that. So therefore, the relationship with that as mystery was less of a frontier, right? So the frontier existed in the natural world outside of your wherever you existed. When an Australian Aborigine goes on walkabout, what's spoken into the village and brought into the universal story of that place is when the individual brings back their experience of their walkabout, of their dance with the world outside the village, right? And in many ways, what we're talking about is, what happens when we as human beings interact with the round door, right? The door that's always been there, and that with practice, we can have a very authentic interplay in our lives with. In other words, the spirit of our being can be given great weight in our decision making if we so choose. But in doing so, we enter into a life of mystery because in letting the soul lead us, the ego loses control of the path. The ego loses control of the reasons why we do things. We have to let go when we entered into the round door. And I think that that's in our hyper rational world. People don't feel comfortable making unreasoned or soulful decisions. It scares them. And they prefer to keep that in the realm of, the Poirot or the Agatha Christie or the Sherlock Holmes. But what's interesting is that contained within those stories, almost universally, there's always some element of the metaphysical that's brought in.
Well, I'm reminded of the audience being captivated by the initial story in Twin Peaks, right? Who killed Laura Palmer? And this mystery, who killed Laura Palmer? Now, once this was revealed, what it revealed was the depth of what that show, what that universe, what Mark Frost and David Lynch were doing there was it really wasn't about this murder mystery. Now, it was about Laura Palmer as a young woman, but more or less, it was the town, it was the veil, it was the door being open again and again. And that's when a lot of people turned away from the show, turned away from that universe, right? Because the very traditional mystery was just the step to the round door, just the step to that depth of mystery that you're bathing in the deeper, greater mystery.
And as you're speaking, I'm reminded of Lost, right? It as a cultural phenomena and the expectation of some in its audience that it was the responsibility of the show's creator and its writers at the end to step in and explain everything. And the outcry that occurred when they chose not to do that. Sure, some mysteries were explained, but in large measure, we as the audience were left with an unknowing about the experience of those people stranded on this island. And, they leave the island, they don't leave the island, where all those things that occur on Lost. The memory of the first time that I watched the last episode of Lost and spent easily the last 45 minutes deeply crying at the experience. How emotionally poignant that episode to this day has on me. I found the depiction that they chose of bringing closure to the show to be extraordinary and beautiful, mainly because it celebrated the mystery rather than sought to solve it. And I think that the very best that we can bring from that kind of that the nature of mystery needs its place. And I understand that science wants to solve mysteries that, storytellers, many storytellers want to bring resolution to their story. But I think that my experience in looking at scientific discovery is always that every new discovery just brings us 1,000 new questions. I love that fact. The more deeply we look into it through science like quantum physics and quantum mechanics, the answers become more and more mysterious in nature. This notion of whatever it is that we are, we're on this living planet, right? We're on Turtle Island. What story do we want to exist in? How is one story different or better? Or all the stories are very different. Let me rephrase that. But every one of those stories that we tell about our existence, they all contain the truth of the culture as it exists at that time. right? The nature of the story that's told now, one could argue, is through the nature of commerce, the nature of advertising. That the story in many ways is told through that lens and not necessarily through the storytelling itself, right? Um, it's a very interesting and if this is the right usage of the word, anachronistic kind of interplay that we can experience when we reflect on what it means to be in the mystery of life and how we experience it culturally through novels and shows and movies. Luna, my daughter Luna, and I recently watched the latest installment of the Knives Out series, and I found it fascinating. And then encouraged my son to watch it, and he watched it with his girlfriend, and they were like, eh. Where I was fascinated by the storytelling and the manner in which the story was told through these seemingly inexplicable twists and turns that were just fascinating and fun.
Yeah, they tickled your curiosity. And I think those films and what Ryan Johnson as the writer and director is really finding to be delicious is the joy of the mystery and almost this like little tittering ooh, let's dive in. There's this amusement to it. It's not an amusement park, I want to be clear, but there's an amusement to that. And I think that's really important when we talk about the nature of mystery, to be amused, to let go into that moment of mystery with your amusement, because maybe it can't be explained any other way. And isn't that just wonderful? The sense of laughter.
Right. And for me as a kid, my first introductions that I can remember are the Abbott and Costello movies. They were all mysteries, right? They would fumble their way into some mystery and then solve it, right? And then, Scooby-Doo came along when I was a little kid. And Scooby-Doo actually had a lot of the metaphysical in its conceptualization. They often would leave and or dangle something that they couldn't explain.
And I think here, when we laugh and enjoy these qualities of mystery through our storytelling mediums, it gets back to a point of stillness for me where when you sit with it, when you've appreciated it through the skill and craft of story, I know for me that when I'm feeling deeply, feeling heavy feelings, weighty feelings, that going and meditating and journaling and taking a walk in nature, all these things are important. They're at the core of it. And going and experiencing a story, going and watching a movie, because it encourages more exploration. It encourages more feeling to feel in that respect, right? But storytelling is this potent, powerful aspect of how we humans show up in the world, right? And one of the other things that we noted down here was revisiting the ascension myth, as well as the myth of adulthood. Now, the ascension myth is how you framed our obsession with getting to the top. This was the way that you explored it in Language of the Soul, A Path of Simplicity, the book and audio book that's available. And it's something that I think we've explored a lot actually on the show. I think we have inadvertently turned into those places quite a bit this past year with generational wealth and AI, because it those are expressions of this, right? And the seriousness of adulthood, right? This notion that one must act a certain way that goes hand in hand with this ascension myth. When I speak to these things, I don't feel a lot of stillness inherent in them, right? It's about how to be busy, how to appear to be busy, how to be taken seriously because you're taking care of business and you're amassing wealth and you're dominating. And you're climbing the rungs of the ladder higher and higher and higher. As I talk about this, I just go, whew, I feel exhausted even trying to frame what the ascension myth is. And I think that tells you something.
Right. But I think you articulated it well. The climbing of the rungs without a sense of our depth as its inherent and central guide. The book begins with a kind of exploration of the ascension myth. And then at a certain point later in the book, I revisit that topic. And I wanted to read from the first paragraph of that piece. As our culture, our nation, our world is breaking under the weight of its collective choices, it is an expression of us all, an inevitable result of self created walls or obstacles built within the ascension culture. Obstacles created to overcome, but instead have become habituated patterns of dis-ease. At first, this disease visits the most vulnerable, and over time, everyone becomes vulnerable to its collective malaise. It appears as a multitude of chronic diseases. Explanations or diagnoses are many, and in large measure, they are correct. They all see the same problem from a myriad of perspectives. Few see humanity and the world around us holistically, and therefore we see parts of the challenge and as well parts of the solutions. In truth, it really doesn't require anyone to see the whole picture. We need only see our part. This brings us closer to the root of the challenge, a disconnection from ourselves, a disconnection that expresses itself first individually through unexamined patterns and then collectively through division within our communities. As I read that, I have to say that it feels like such a just a tragic synopsis of the state of our world. In many ways, I think what we ultimately decided was in looking at that theme is that, well, we had looked at ascension culture through the book, we had looked at it in other ways, and I've kind of come to realize that, it needs to be repeated, but it's not necessarily something new. By virtue of the fact that I'm reading from the book, it really does speak to the idea that it's material we covered that bears repeating.
It does. What I hear at the core of your writing doesn't surprise me in any way, but it delights me in the synchronicities of the other topics we have on the table. Because when we're speaking of the ascension culture and the obsessive qualities that grow from this space of fragmentation, division, dis-ease, it speaks to the moment and how we measure or express our own value, our worth, our well-being, our self-compassion, our creative life force, right? It's quite striking, the dance that everything here today embodies. But that's the beauty of how we as spiritual beings, humans, as these spirits of curiosity and joy, can transform our malaise and our suffering into an opportunity to heal and grow when we take a moment to be playful, when we take a moment to be still.
It's about how do we explore the notion of the moment, like just as it is, now and now and now, but also like how is it measured? How do we measure moments? What do we value within ourselves and in others? And in many ways, this idea came out of, as many of my ideas came out of soul writing, right? So, I was at a shifting point around an inner conversation I was having with the notion of success. And how do I measure the value of my actions, my choices, my life's work, and in the manner in which I've chosen to practice life in the world it was a painful moment. Um, I was learning how to surrender with another step out of this ego attachment to not just being seen, but how I was being seen by the world. And it was the acknowledgement that if, as I alluded to earlier in our conversation around the notion of the mystery of life, in many ways, learning how to make sense of something that is being led by one's soul's calling. It creates an inner conflict because the ego wants to make sense of something that often it doesn't make sense. And my intention is to let go further and further into the realm of the soul, to surrender to that, that to try to make sense of it when you're really seeking to bridge two worlds, because that's the nature of the veil, the round door, right? And that in many ways, I'm seeking to live a life that bridges that way of being. And that was in many ways the central part of it, that possibility for us all, that we all can be soul led, that we all can exist in that bridge. And to do so really involves a very different holding of the feedback loop that is, how other human beings interact with your journey, right? And holding true to that path, even in the midst of that feedback loop. So, in the midst of this inquiry that I was making with the moment, I don't remember, did we co-compose this, Ben, or was this Marjorie writing? I think it was you and I putting together these 7 questions. Yeah, I think it started out as journaling, and then you and I co-composed and framed the questions a bit. I think what we're going to do is, for those of you who do receive our newsletter, we're going to have the 7 questions included in the next newsletter that will come out with this pod.
If you have not signed up for our newsletter, it's super easy to do so. You can go over to martinperkins.com and there's a little sign up sheet at the bottom of any page that you go to. So whether it's the home page or the acupuncture page or the art and design page, you're going to scroll down and you'll see sign up for newsletter, and you can enter your email address right in, and the next newsletter will come to you.
The last topic is centered around some writing I had done on the roots of disease. It was centered around a conversation that I had with a client. I had had the flu, and they said, well, you so rarely get sick. And they had known me for many years, and they were like, you have a great immune system. And the truth is, I don't really have a robust immune system in the sense that at this juncture, it's much improved. But what I have is a set of practices. I have a self-care practice. I made many poor decisions in my youth, and there were consequences in terms of how I ate, the substances I put in my body, my relationship to rest, and that's what's radically changed. So it's interesting when people talk about an immune system, from my perspective, what we're really talking about is how do I actually take care of myself? We can't undo what was, but we can, with practice, improve how we take care of ourselves. And that has an enormous impact on our ability to live a long and very vibrant and, very active life. What the world refers to as a strong immune system is really the byproduct of the cumulative effect of our choices. And that the more consciously we choose for ourselves over time is how our immune system will respond in turn. And I mean that around a stillness practice, our practice with rest in all of its forms, the 4 forms of rest I'm referring to, which I've referred to countless times in countless places. And as well as a healthy relationship to exercise or movement, a healthy relationship to a diet that works for us, and what it really means to be connected to a sense of purpose, right? A sense of calling in our lives. And that if there's 8 billion people on the planet, there's 8 billion distinct expressions of a sense of purpose and calling. And not many of them have nothing to do with our jobs or anything like that. A lot of people came to do very, very lovely but yet very simple things. And that's what this life has been or will be or will continue to be about for them. And that's more than okay.
It's extraordinary.
It is. It is extraordinary, right? Because there are, in truth, the possibility of 8 billion extraordinary people on the planet. That extraordinary nature. It exists in all of us.
Well, Martin, I want to thank you for this incredible collaboration over the past year and really bringing the podcast into a form all its own, something that exists within each of us and between us, and especially with our listeners. So I also want to thank each of you for coming in each week or stepping in when you choose to listen. There's a energetic quality through the ether that is felt and appreciated.
Yeah. Number one, I'm deeply grateful for our collaboration and the joy and the learning that I've received in being in partnership with Ben, and as well the deep gratitude I have for the people who've chosen to listen to what we're sharing. That, as the expression goes, that dig our vibe, right?
It's good. Vibes are good in that sense.
Yeah.
And the depth, I would offer the depth that's there once you step into a space where you go, I like the vibes.
Yeah.
There's a greater and greater quality of depth of knowing that can arise there too. So I appreciate that part of the journey, the learning, the knowing that grows, that keeps going. Because a year from now, I have no idea what the podcast will look like, but I'm excited to just experience it and create it.
Yeah, to find out. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. It's our one of our many explorations of the great mystery.
Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.